Welcome to Your Next Chapter, where we spotlight audio creators and industry leaders shaping the future of podcasting. I'm Jeremiah Tittle, CEO of Next Chapter Podcasts. This season, we're exploring how museums are using podcasts to expand their reach, deepen engagement, and build trust. Making the case that every museum needs a podcast. Whether you're in audio or cultural institutions, there's something here for you. Today, I'm joined by Matt Shindell. He's the curator at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum and co-host of AirSpace, now in its 10th season. Do you believe that? Recorded live at the AAM conference in LA. We talk about the humble beginnings, landing big name guests like Jack Black, and how podcasting helps the Smithsonian reach beyond its walls to connect with a global audience. Let's jump in. Should I say we should fly in or rocket in? Enjoy the conversation. So we're here in LA at AAM, the museum conference of note, and really happy to be joined now by Matt Shindell of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Matt, thank you so much for joining me here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the theme of this event, which I feel is quite compelling as it relates to what we do in podcasting. You're at the nexus of a space I'm very interested in. I guess we both are. You're representing a museum, you work at a museum, and we make a podcast with a museum, so we're on common ground. Although I work with a history museum and you work with the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and you get to interview or have people on your show like Jack Black, which we'll get to maybe in a moment. But first of all, just wanted to get your perspective and your comments on maybe the theme of museums and trust and why this common ground maybe between museums, how it is the most trusted form of media due to the survey and now is the theme of this event in relation to podcasts and how this trust factor between hosts and the messages and the team behind podcasting and the people who listen to them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the relationship between museums and trust in the first place, it's really about the fact that, we are, many of us, those museums that focus on history, we are the keepers of the things, right? All of the objects, the artifacts, the stories about, in our case, we're a national museum, so it's, the story of the development of aviation and spaceflight here in this country. And, we try to tell that story in the most impartial way and let the people who sort of made those achievements in spaceflight stand out as the people who are sort of telling their stories through the presence of their objects, their artifacts, etc. And so, we tried to carry that forward in podcasting with the idea that, we were going to be an extension of what the museum already did, but we were going to be engaging in some ways the same audience that came to the museum already and giving them extra content than what they get when they come to the museum, so they could take the museum with them wherever they went. But also we wanted to engage with folks who may not have yet had the opportunity to come to the museum and start to share stories with them. And even though we started, staying pretty close to what was in our collections and the stories that we were already kind of telling in the museum, we've really developed over the course of 10 seasons now to telling stories that are just sort of in our wheelhouse, in that they're related to aviation and space flight, but not necessarily to things that we have on display right at that moment in the museum or to people who might not really appear in the museum.
So I'm wondering now why you haven't had the Wright brothers on yet. No. We like to make jokes, especially when we're talking about history museums, on all the people that went before who aren't able to be interviewed. But you talk to current, I mentioned Jack Black, but you talk to scientists. I'd love to, from your words, to understand more about how you go about producing this podcast, the types of people you talk to, and the types of stories that you tell.
Yeah. Well, we're always looking for those stories, right? That's where it starts for us, is trying to find a story. And then, if we find a good story that's related to the history of spaceflight and aviation or to things that are happening right now in spaceflight and aviation, that's where we start. right, is when we have a good story. So, for example, we recently did an episode about a group of women from Spain who have gone through this analog Mars habitat experience in the Utah desert at the Mars Desert Research Station. They call themselves the Hypatia crew, and this is their second time going through the Mars Desert Research Station as an all-women crew, all Spanish women crew, kind of bringing Spain to Mars in a sense, right? And encouraging women in Spain and girls in Spain to, follow careers in STEM and follow their examples, right? So a wonderful, inspiring group of women that we got to know and got to tell their story by bringing them in, via interviews to tell us about that experience. And at the time we interviewed them, they had already done their first mission and they were gearing up for their second mission. So, we were really excited to know, what did they learn the first time around and what are they bringing with them this time? What do they think the big challenges would be? What are their big goals in terms of mainly education and outreach that they're trying to do with that program? So, those women had such a great story that it just made a good episode. And, that is kind of how we approach the podcast, like I said, looking for the story and then using it to talk about themes in aviation and spaceflight.
I attended your panel yesterday. I really enjoyed it. One thing that surprised me, I'd love to get your comments on, had to do with the fact that, so I introduced you as coming from Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. So I know how much roughly these budgets are for big museums, but I'm wondering for small to mid-sized museums, they might benefit from understanding kind of the humble beginnings of your podcast. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of where you started and how you've maybe expanded over time to get support to keep doing this amazing podcast.
Yeah, so really we did start very humbly. And I think one of the things that we were demonstrating in the beginning was that we could kind of do the show without too much additional financial support on top of, we all already were full-time employees of the museum, and none of us were hired to do a podcast, but, we were willing to kind of put our time into it in addition to all of the things that we were already doing and kind of feel our way through and learn how to put together a podcast. And, I think for a small or medium-sized museum, it is possible to do a podcast on a shoestring budget. It just really requires a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, right? But one of the good things about having some resources is that you can start bringing in folks with the expertise to produce and edit and help you, have a podcast at the end of the day that sounds more professional. Now, you can learn that stuff yourself, but it's great to be able to bring in someone who already knows how to do it and who can bring that expertise. And that's what we've done over the years is, we've had producers work with us on contract. And our current producer is wonderful. Her name is Jennifer Weingart, and she does so much of the work of making the podcast sound good from beginning to end. She helps to pre-interview all of the guests. She comes up with the outlines for the discussions that my co-host and I have on the show, and she, puts together the actual rough cut and fine cut and sends it off to production. So having someone like that is great. If you can't afford someone like that, you can still do it. But I think for us, it's been wonderful being able to do that.
I love that. Well, that was one thing I really appreciated as someone I'm obviously on camera, on microphone at this very moment, but throughout my career, I've been behind the scenes for a lot of the production work. So when you shouted out the even previous producers you don't actually work with anymore, I was like, okay, this is a place that you obviously respect the craft, that you appreciate the people who have made you look and sound good previously, and just going back to the last point about kind of your growth story. And so do you think the Lockheed Martin sponsorship and support would have taken place had you not already had started a podcast? Do you think that the legwork in the beginning kind of greased the wheels for that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's hard for me to speculate on that. I mean, we're very happy to have the Lockheed Martin sponsorship, and we're glad that they, took notice of the fact that we had this great product. I think it's a great product that we've honed over 10 seasons of work, right? And going back to those producers that we've worked with, Jocelyn Frank, Lizzie Peabody, and now Jennifer Weingart, they've really helped to shape. I mean, they do make us sound good, and I don't want to say that that's all they do, though, because they also really, over these years, these 10 seasons, have helped define our sound, right, along with us. They're not just supporting, they're really participating in what the podcast at the end of the day is. And so, maybe Lockheed Martin was able to appreciate that we had built this thing and that it was kind of ready to go. It was already running, and we're happy to support us continuing and going on into more seasons. And that sponsorship's also allowing us to do new things like live events and some advertising that we've never done before. So, sponsorship really does help you to kind of get to the next level, I guess. And so we're very grateful to have it.
All right, let's do some fun stuff now. What was one of your most fun stories? I obviously gravitate towards Jack Black because he's such an entertaining, now big movie star. Been following his career since he wasn't such a big movie star, but he told a really good story in one of the promotional examples that you gave that I assume people really gravitated to on social media. So that's my offering. You can tell that story, or you can add whichever other anecdote that might stand out to you from something that was fun for you to do.
No, that's a great example, and one that I really enjoyed. So what had happened was there was a meme going around on social media about a woman named Judith Love Cohen who had been pregnant while working on, some, I believe it was either software or hardware. No, I think it was a software engineering question for the Apollo program. And so the meme went, she had taken her work with her when she went into labor. She had already had a kid before. She knew what the signs of labor were. She went to work anyway, worked as long as she could, and then took the work with her when she went to the hospital to give birth. And the end of the meme was, oh, and by the way, the boy she gave birth to that day was Jack Black. And so we saw that story and really wanted to track it down and, get it from the source. So we did. We tracked Jack Black down, and when we originally talked to Jack Black via email, he said, well, my older brother knows the story better than I do because he was there. Why don't you interview both of us? So we ended up getting on Zoom with both Jack Black and his brother Neil, and had them tell us the story and tell us all about their mother. And we ended up with a great episode featuring them. Yeah, and that was a lot of fun because, I had grown up watching Jack Black do different things. I remember, I must have been 20 years ago going to see Tenacious D in concert when they were opening for Weezer. So, sitting across the virtual Zoom room from Jack Black was a real kick for me.
Great story, and I wanted to ask you maybe to cut to the heart of this show that you've been working on for so long and so well. Why do you host this podcast, and how did you get into it?
Yeah, it's a funny thing because I'm actually I don't consider myself a great speaker, and I consider myself a kind of an awkward conversationalist. So the idea that I would host a podcast still kind of confuses me. But what happened was, I showed up at the museum 10 years ago when I first started working there, and I was surprised that we didn't already have a podcast. And I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time because I was a commuter. I had to fill 45 minutes of commute every day, and podcasts were a great way to do it. And so, I asked one of my colleagues who I had gotten to be friends with why we didn't have a podcast. Was anybody talking about having a podcast? And as it turned out, there was a group of folks who thought that the museum should have a podcast, but they hadn't quite figured out how to do it yet and who would host it. They thought that it really should be hosted by a curator, but they didn't think any of the curators were interested in doing it. So I kind of threw myself in front of it, and that's just kind of how it happened. And I've really enjoyed every minute of it because in addition to the work that I do as a curator, hosting the podcast allows me to learn things about our collections that I wouldn't otherwise know because they're sort of in other folks' sort of realm of expertise, to meet people that I wouldn't otherwise get to meet and talk to them, and to reach audiences that my scholarly work or even my exhibits work isn't already reaching. So, all around it's been very enjoyable and fulfilling for me, even though I don't think I would ever pick myself out of a random group of people as like the most likely person to co-host a podcast.
Well, I would argue that your humility about this and, the fact that, maybe it wasn't your day job in the beginning, it still isn't, right? It's a part of all the other things you do with the Air and Space Museum. So all those things, I think, make people gravitate towards you, and you just are easy to talk to, and it's been really nice to, in a short period of time, get to know you a little bit. So this has been nice for me. But I wanted to ask you if there's any anecdote, whether it's, we could talk about some boss high up in the museum that, someone listened to an episode and that became like a big point of pride, or it could be something, a young person that listened to. We had another story from Zoe Goldman from the Getty talk about a retired lawyer in Florida who wrote a letter in. But just any anecdotal kind of just feel good that kind of confirms you're like, I do this for a good reason. It's not just for whatever positives that someone might see from the outside. I'm just curious.
So I do sometimes meet some of our listeners out in the wild, and that's always a lot of fun. And there's one moment that sticks out in my mind, which was I was actually at a History of Science conference in Mexico. And I have to say first, like when we open up our podcast episodes, back when we used to have 3 hosts, we used to always say, welcome to AirSpace from the National Air and Space Museum. I'm Nick, and then I would say I'm Matt, and then Emily would say I'm Emily. And so that was our sort of introduction at the billboard of every episode. So I'm at this conference, and I'm in a room, and I'm speaking to someone and answering a question, and someone in the audience says, "You're Matt." And I said, "Yeah, I'm Matt." She says, "No, you're Matt," like the I'm Matt thing coming back at me. And so we ended up talking after the panel, and she is a fabulous historian of science herself, and had a great idea about doing an episode about astronaut Barbie. And that's how we ended up doing our episode about astronaut Barbie, and having her, Ellie Armstrong, on as a guest to talk about astronaut Barbie. So, there's these great moments that happen where, I wasn't expecting anyone within the history of science community really to be listening to our podcast, because it's not geared towards specialists or experts. But there she was a listener, and recognized me just by my voice, and saying I'm Matt, right? Which I thought was kind of crazy. But it's moments like that I really enjoy.
2 more for you. The second to last one, I wanted to ask you about representation. I think it's come up a couple of times. We're 2 white men, not going to mince words about that, but it seems to me, based on some of the stories you've told here and just having this conversation, how important is that to you? In STEM, there's movies about it in NASA, et cetera, but why is that important to you?
I think it's important that we cover a broad range of stories and really represent everyone who's involved in the history of aviation and spaceflight as much as we can, right? And I am, a white man, and my co-host is a white woman, but we bring on a lot of guests of various, different backgrounds and identities, and hopefully, I think, allow them to kind of represent themselves rather than us kind of doing anything other than just providing them a platform to tell their story to us and with us. So, I think that's our approach to that. And we also have these sort of mini-series side projects that we do every now and then. We've done 4 of them. And in those, we kind of step back and allow other people to come in and host the show temporarily on different topics. So, that also allows us to be more representative of, the diversity of people who actually, represent aviation and spaceflight.
Last question, as promised. I I wanted to ask you about what's important to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, as it relates to the podcast. What value do you think they perceive, and would you say that's accurately reflective of your position on the value that you bring to the world?
Well, even before we started the podcast, the Air and Space Museum and the Smithsonian more generally was really interested in engaging with folks who were not in the DC region, who were not maybe visiting the museum already. They had this sort of beyond the walls philosophy where they were trying to reach just large numbers of people with Smithsonian content and engaging with them as much as they could. So the podcast fit into that kind of category, I suppose, of things that the Smithsonian already wanted to do, which is why even before we started, Smithsonian had already started their Side Door podcast that's now hosted by Lizzie Peabody, who was on the panel with me yesterday. So, it fit into that area. And then also, I think once we had the podcast up and running, it was very successful, I think, in engaging folks and in, building an audience that was, it overlapped with the museum's existing audience, but it brought new people in. And I think that was really attractive to the museum and continues to be one of the reasons why we're, still going now 10 seasons in, right? Is that we continue to build an audience that's not specific to, folks who visited the museum, although those folks, I hope, are listening and love us too. But, a lot of our listeners are just people who are interested in the stories that we tell and, prefer to consume those stories through podcasts as opposed to visiting museums and things like that. So, I think we help the museum and the Smithsonian to build a bigger tent than they've already built by engaging folks through podcasts and through our social media presence as well.
Thank you so much for joining me. If you're interested in learning more about our Next Chapter Accelerator program, please go to nextchapterpodcast.com/contact and we'll reach out. Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Next Chapter. I'm your host, JT. Our executive producer is Nick Kastner. This is edited by Justin Cortese. We drop episodes every other week. Please follow the show. And thanks for listening.